In this video, we'll uncover the chilling story of Officer David Martinez, a brave police officer who responded to a wildfire call only to encounter something beyond explanation. That night, Officer Martinez lost his life. But what makes his story truly terrifying is that he returned with a message that could change everything we thought we knew about California's fires. It started out like any other shift. Officer Martinez was wrapping up his evening at the precinct when a call came through. A wildfire had broken out near Sierra Highway. It was his job to respond. Martinez had seen plenty of fires before. This was supposed to be just another routine call. But as he approached the scene, something didn't feel right. Driving through the deserted roads, Martinez noticed strange things. The air was unnaturally still, almost suffocating. His car's radio crackled with static, cutting off the dispatcher's instructions. Then, through the interference, he swore he heard a voice. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It was faint, distant, but clear enough to send chills down his spine. It said his name. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the static. But as he got closer to the fire, the strange occurrences only got worse. When he arrived, the fire wasn't like anything he'd seen before. The flames glowed too brightly, moving in ways that didn't seem natural. They almost seemed alive. As Martinez approached, he noticed something even more unsettling. Standing just beyond the flames was a shadowy figure. It wasn't moving, it wasn't trying to escape, it just stood there watching him. What happened next defies all logic. Officer Martinez stepped toward the fire, determined to investigate, but something stopped him. Hours later, his colleagues found him lying near the fire's edge. He was lifeless, but his story didn't end there. Against all odds, Martinez came back, and what he revealed about that fire will leave you questioning everything. What did he see? What did he hear? And what is the terrifying truth behind California's wildfires? Stay tuned. The alarm clock buzzed sharply, cutting through the stillness of Officer David Martinez's modest bedroom. He groaned, rubbing his face as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains. His wife, Elena, stirred beside him, her sleepy voice breaking the silence. "Another long day," she murmured, her eyes barely opening. David leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Just another shift," he replied, though the heaviness in his chest hinted otherwise. In the kitchen, his 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, was already digging into her cereal. "You're gonna catch the bad guys today, right, Dad?" she asked, her eyes lighting up as he ruffled her hair. "Always, sweetie. That's my job," he said with a smile. By the time he got to the precinct, the camaraderie among his team was in full swing. Coffee cups clattered, laughter echoed, and Martinez joined in the usual banter. His partner, Officer Greg Daniels, handed him a fresh cup of coffee. "Martinez, you're too chipper for someone who hasn't even clocked in yet," Daniels joked. "Gotta keep the energy up, Greg," David shot back, grinning, but beneath the surface, Martinez carried a weight that no one else saw. The demands of the job, the sleepless nights, the constant worry about keeping his family safe, all of it had been piling up. Around noon, the day took an unusual turn. Dispatch crackled over the radio, the voice sounding tenser than usual. "Attention all units. Wildfire reported near Sierra Highway. Initial reports indicate rapid spread. First responders needed on site." Martinez glanced at Daniels. "Another one already. It's fire season, but this feels early." Daniels shrugged. "You're up for it, Martinez. You know the drill." Martinez grabbed his keys, but something about the dispatch call lingered in his mind. The tone of the dispatcher wasn't just urgent, it was unnervingly serious. The drive out to Sierra Highway started uneventfully. Martinez's cruiser hummed along the winding roads, the radio playing softly in the background. The sun blazed overhead, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then, about halfway there, the first sign of trouble emerged. The sky darkened, not like a typical overcast day, but in an unnatural, almost menacing way. Martinez glanced at the horizon, where the wildfire was supposed to be. He squinted. The fire's glow was visible even from miles away, unnaturally bright and flickering in strange patterns. His radio crackled to life, breaking his focus. But it wasn't dispatch. The static was broken by faint, distorted words. His name, Martinez. He froze, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Dispatch, come again," he called out, but the radio only responded with more static. He shook his head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe interference, he thought. These backroads were notorious for weak signals. But his heart raced nonetheless. As he neared the scene, the eerie signs multiplied. The air became unnervingly still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds of wildlife, chirping birds, rustling leaves, were gone. Then he saw it. The fire loomed ahead, not like any wildfire he'd seen before. It pulsed and glowed, almost as if it were alive. Martinez slowed the cruiser, his instincts screaming at him to stop. He opened the door, stepping out cautiously. The heat hit him instantly, but what chilled him wasn't the temperature, it was the sound, whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the flames themselves. He looked around, trying to find the source, but there was no one there. "Hello," he called out, his voice firm but shaky, no answer. Just the crackling of the fire and those faint, haunting whispers. Martinez stepped closer, his flashlight cutting through the smoky haze. The brightness of the flames seemed unnatural, almost otherworldly. Something felt horribly wrong. His instincts told him to get back in the cruiser, to call for backup, but his feet wouldn't move. The whispers grew louder, circling him, wrapping around him like a phantom. Martinez. This time it was unmistakable. It was his name, clear as day, spoken by a voice that wasn't there. He stumbled back, his heart pounding as he scanned the area. Then, just beyond the edge of the flames, he saw it. A shadow. It stood motionless, almost human in shape, but there was no detail, just a black, indistinct figure watching him. It didn't move, it didn't run, it just stood there. Martinez's mouth went dry. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, but something about the shadow held him in place. Then, in an instant, it vanished. He blinked, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Was it the smoke playing tricks on him? The heat? Before he could process it, the whispers surged again, louder this time, almost deafening. Martinez stumbled back toward his cruiser, his mind racing. He had to call for help. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a wildfire. Something else was at play here. As he fumbled with his radio, his eyes flicked back toward the fire. For a split second, he swore he saw the shadow again, just at the edge of the flames. Watching, waiting. Then the radio crackled once more, but this time it wasn't static. "Martinez, come closer." Martinez's pulse raced as the voice on the radio faded into static once again. His instincts told him to leave, but something about the fire and the shadow compelled him to stay. He had to find out what was really happening, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Arrival at the scene, the gravel crunched beneath the tires as Officer David Martinez brought his cruiser to a stop on the desolate road. He stared ahead at the towering inferno that lit up the horizon. The fire wasn't spreading in jagged, chaotic patterns like most wildfires he'd seen. Instead, it pulsed, glowing unnaturally bright in distinct waves, almost like it was breathing. The eerie stillness that surrounded the scene was what struck him first. There was no roar of flames, no sound of rushing wind that usually accompanied fires of this magnitude. It was quiet, too quiet. The only noise was the faint crackling of the fire and the soft hum of his cruiser's engine. Martinez stepped out, the oppressive heat hitting him like a wall. He instinctively shielded his face with his hand and squinted toward the blaze. Smoke billowed upward in thick, twisting tendrils, but something about it looked off. It was denser than usual, clinging to the ground in unnatural patterns, and the colors shifted between shades of orange, red, and even black, as though it were alive. Grabbing his flashlight, Martinez keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 417. I'm on site at the Sierra Highway fire. Requesting backup, over." The response came almost immediately, but it wasn't what he expected. His radio crackled with static, followed by distorted voices. Words came through, but they were garbled and broken, like multiple people were speaking at once. He could make out bits and pieces. "Leave" and "danger" were the clearest fragments, but the rest dissolved into an unintelligible cacophony. Martinez frowned, adjusting the dial on his radio. "Dispatch, do you copy? This is Unit 417. Please repeat." The static persisted, louder this time, before abruptly cutting out. Silence. A chill ran down his spine. The odd behavior of the radio combined with the unnatural glow of the fire was enough to put him on edge. He scanned the area with his flashlight, the beam slicing through the thick haze of smoke. Shadows danced and flickered, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the feeling that he wasn't alone crept up on him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Hello," he called out, his voice steady but uneasy. "Is anyone out there? This is the LAPD. If you can hear me, call out." No response. As he moved closer to the fire's edge, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely distinguishable from the crackling of the flames, but they grew louder with every step he took. Words and phrases swirled around him, disjointed and overlapping, as though dozens of voices were trying to speak to him all at once. His flashlight flickered, the beam weakening and sputtering as if the battery were failing. That's when he saw it. Through the thick smoke, a figure emerged. It was humanoid in shape, but completely black, like a silhouette cut from the air itself. The edges of its form were blurred, almost shimmering, as though it wasn't entirely there. The figure stood perfectly still, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. Martinez froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, LAPD, identify yourself," he shouted, his voice carrying over the eerie silence. The figure didn't respond, it didn't move, it just stood there watching him. "Are you hurt? Do you need assistance?" Martinez took a cautious step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his holstered weapon. Something about the figure set every instinct in his body on high alert. It wasn't just the way it stood so unnaturally still, it was the feeling of being observed, of having its attention focused entirely on him. As he stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him in a chaotic symphony of voices. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the beam illuminated the figure more clearly. But what he saw made his blood run cold. There were no features, no face, no eyes, nothing to identify it as human, just a void where its head and body should have been. And yet he could feel its gaze boring into him as if it were studying him, judging him. Martinez stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. What are you?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke being carried away by the wind. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving nothing but empty space where it had stood. Martinez hurried forward, his flashlight scanning the ground where the figure had been. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even heavier than before. His boots crunched against the scorched earth as he reached the spot, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of movement, just a patch of ground burned blacker than the rest, as though the fire had lingered there longer than anywhere else. He crouched down, running his fingers over the scorched earth. It was warm, but not hot enough to burn. The edges of the patch were sharp and defined, as if the fire had been deliberately contained within that spot. Martinez straightened, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Something wasn't right. The fire, the whispers, the figure, none of it made any sense. It was as if the laws of nature had been suspended in this place, replaced by something far more sinister. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed, his radio crackled to life again. This time, the static was more intense, accompanied by a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine, and then, through the noise, he heard it again. Martinez. The voice was clearer this time, unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the radio, it was coming from the fire. Martinez's pulse raced as he stumbled back toward his cruiser, his mind reeling from what he'd just seen. He couldn't explain it, but one thing was clear: this wasn't an ordinary wildfire. Something else was at work here, and whatever it wasn't done with him yet. First contact, Martinez stood frozen beside his cruiser, staring at the unnaturally glowing fire that stretched into the distance. The whispers still echoed faintly in his ears, growing softer as if luring him deeper into the heart of the blaze. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. Whatever this was, it defied explanation, but something within him refused to back away. He had to know what was happening, even if every fiber of his being screamed for him to leave. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped further into the smoky expanse, his boots crunching on the scorched ground. The light from the flames illuminated the barren landscape, revealing charred trees and an unsettling emptiness. As he scanned the area, his beam caught something glinting ahead. His pulse quickened. A vehicle, burned almost beyond recognition, sat in the middle of the blackened forest. Martinez approached cautiously, the heat of the fire making the air shimmer around him. The car was a husk of what it once was, its windows shattered, its metal frame warped and melted. There were no signs of passengers, no bodies, no personal belongings, no footprints leading away from the wreckage. It was as if whoever had been inside had vanished. He moved the flashlight across the scene, the beam catching another vehicle further ahead. This one was in a similar state, completely burned out, its tires reduced to ashen remnants. Martinez's jaw tightened. Two cars abandoned so close to each other, and not a single trace of the people who had driven them. It didn't add up. "Where is everyone?" he muttered under his breath. As if in answer, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the area, cutting through the oppressive heat of the fire. Martinez shivered, his breath fogging up in front of him. The drastic shift in temperature was so abrupt that it felt like stepping into another world. He glanced around, the eerie chill only adding to his growing unease. His radio crackled again, the static louder and more erratic than before. He grabbed it instinctively, hoping for some clarity. "Dispatch, this is Unit 417. Do you copy?" He called, his voice tinged with desperation, but the response was not what he expected. The static gave way to faint, overlapping voices, their words impossible to make out. Then one voice rose above the rest, soft, deep, and deliberate. "David," he froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the first time he'd heard his name tonight, but this time it was clear and unmistakable. The voice seemed to come from both the radio and the surrounding air, wrapping around him like a cold embrace. "Who's there?" Martinez demanded, turning in circles as he tried to locate the source. The whispers grew louder, converging into a symphony of unintelligible words. Then, as quickly as they had come, they stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire. Martinez gripped his flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. He turned back toward the burned vehicles, but his heart nearly stopped when he saw it. The shadowy figure from earlier, standing just beyond the flames. It was closer this time, clearer in the eerie glow of the fire. Its form was still indistinct, a silhouette that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But now Martinez could feel its presence more acutely. It wasn't just watching him, it was studying him, its attention as heavy as the smoke-filled air. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound authoritative. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost as if considering him. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo both inside and outside his mind, it spoke. "The fire feeds on your kind's carelessness." The words sent a chill down Martinez's spine. His kind. What did that mean, and how could something be speaking to him like this? He tried to form a response, but the figure continued, its tone calm but heavy with warning. "Your greed, your destruction, it has woken the flames. And they will not stop until they are satisfied." Martinez felt a lump form in his throat. The cryptic warning made no sense, but there was an undeniable weight to the figure's words. He took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. "What are you talking about?" "What flames? Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rising. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke carried off by the wind. Martinez lunged forward, his flashlight cutting through the haze, but there was nothing left. The shadow had disappeared as if it had never been there at all. Then, without warning, the fire surged. The flames roared to life, their intensity doubling in an instant. Martinez stumbled back, shielding his face as the heat became almost unbearable. The fire moved unnaturally, leaping toward him in twisting, snake-like tendrils. It wasn't spreading along the ground, it was reaching for him as though it had a mind of its own. "Dispatch, I need backup now." He shouted into his radio, but there was no response. The static had returned, louder and more chaotic than before. The flames surged closer, forcing him to retreat toward his cruiser. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Fires didn't behave like this. They didn't move with intent. They didn't feed. Martinez reached the door of his cruiser and yanked it open, throwing himself inside just as the flames reached the edge of the road. Slamming the door shut, he fumbled for the keys and started the engine. The tires spun against the gravel as he backed away from the advancing fire, his eyes fixed on the unnatural inferno. As he drove away, his mind raced with questions. Who or what was the shadowy figure? What did it mean by "your kind's carelessness"? And how could a fire act like this? He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow standing behind him once more. But the road was empty, save for the glow of the flames fading into the distance. Martinez gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he tried to steady his breathing. He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary wildfire. And whatever was happening out there, it wasn't done with him yet. The escape. Martinez gripped the wheel as his cruiser sped along the darkened road. His breath was shallow, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts. What had he seen back there? What was that shadowy figure? And what was happening to this fire? He stole a glance in his rearview mirror. The inferno was no longer just behind him, it was following him. The flames leaped unnaturally across the landscape, racing faster than any wildfire he had ever witnessed. The fire wasn't spreading as nature intended, it was chasing him. "Dispatch, I need backup. The fire is spreading rapidly. This isn't normal," Martinez shouted into his radio. Static filled his ears. Then, faintly, that same distorted voice he had heard before broke through. "David. Come back." The voice was unmistakably familiar, but he couldn't place it. Was it dispatch? Was it the figure? His hands tightened around the steering wheel, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving. Without warning, a massive wall of flame erupted ahead of him, blocking the road. Martinez slammed the brakes, the cruiser screeching to a halt mere feet from the inferno. He threw the car into reverse, but the flames surged behind him as well. He was surrounded. "Damn it," he muttered, his heart pounding. His mind raced for a solution, but the fire was closing in too fast. Within seconds, the cruiser was engulfed in a blistering heat that made the air inside unbearable. Smoke began seeping through the vents, filling the cabin. He had no choice. Martinez kicked open the door and leapt out, coughing as the acrid smoke stung his lungs. The heat was oppressive, like standing inside a furnace, and the glow of the flames bathed everything in a hellish red light. Martinez stumbled into the forest, his flashlight barely cutting through the dense smoke that surrounded him. The trees were blackened, their branches skeletal and burning. The ground beneath him was hot to the touch, each step crunching against ash and embers. He needed to find a way out, but the fire was relentless. It moved with purpose, snaking through the trees as if it were alive, herding him deeper into the woods. Then came the voices. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to ride on the smoke. But as Martinez pressed forward, they grew louder, clearer, and far more sinister. "David," he froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Elena, his wife. "David, help us." Martinez spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Elena," he called out, his voice cracking. "Where are you?" The voices grew louder, overlapping and echoing through the forest. "Daddy, please help us." "Sofia." Martinez's heart felt like it was being crushed. His daughter's voice was filled with terror, and it seemed to come from every direction. He turned frantically, searching the smoky haze for any sign of them. "Where are you?" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. The whispers began to twist and distort, merging into a cacophony of screams and cries. Martinez stumbled backward, his mind reeling. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His family was safe at home. This was the fire playing tricks on him, preying on his deepest fears, but it felt real. The sound of his wife and daughter crying out for him was too vivid, too haunting. He pressed on, his legs burning from exhaustion, his lungs struggling against the thick, suffocating smoke. The fire seemed to toy with him, cutting off every possible escape route and pushing him deeper into its grasp. The whispers became laughter, low, guttural chuckles that sent shivers down his spine. The flames crackled louder, their movements almost playful as they danced closer. Martinez tripped over a charred root, collapsing hard onto the ashen ground. He gasped for air, the smoke wrapping around him like a living thing. His vision blurred as tears streamed down his face, both from the smoke and the overwhelming fear clawing at his mind. Through the haze, he saw the shadow again. It stood just beyond the flames, watching him silently. Its form was still indistinct, shifting and flickering like the fire itself. Martinez tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, his voice too weak. The shadow took a step closer. "The fire feeds on your fear," it said, its voice calm yet chilling. "Your kind gave it life, your kind let it grow." Martinez tried to respond, but his body betrayed him. He was too weak to move, too weak to fight. The heat pressed down on him, crushing him under its unbearable weight. The shadow lingered for a moment longer, then dissolved into the flames. Martinez reached out weakly, his fingers brushing against the scorched earth. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling his ears with a deafening roar. His head spun, the world around him tilting and fading into darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went black was a single, clear voice, his daughter's, soft and pleading. "Daddy, don't leave us." Martinez's body lay motionless as the fire continued to consume the forest around him. The scene was eerily still, the only movement coming from the twisting flames. What had started as a routine call had now spiraled into something far more terrifying, and this was only the beginning. The other side darkness surrounded Martinez, heavy and oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was deeper than that, as though the void itself had weight, pressing down on him. Slowly he became aware of a faint sound, like a distant hum. It grew louder, resonating in his chest, pulling him upward from the depths of unconsciousness. His eyes opened, but the world around him wasn't the one he had left. Martinez lay on the ground, staring up at a sky that was neither day nor night. It shifted between muted gray and a dull, orange glow, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The air was still, unnaturally so, and carried a faint metallic tang that made him instinctively hold his breath. He sat up, wincing as his body protested. The forest was gone. In its place was a small, ghostly town, its edges obscured by a swirling mist. The buildings were old, their facades weathered and cracked, yet no signs of life stirred within. There were no birds, no wind, no sound at all, only the eerie hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Where am I?" Martinez muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. He rose unsteadily to his feet, his boots crunching on what appeared to be ash. As he looked around, a wave of unease settled over him. There was something familiar about this place, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it, and then he saw them. Figures began to emerge from the mist, their outlines blurry at first. As they drew closer, Martinez's breath caught in his throat. These weren't strangers, they were faces he knew, faces he hadn't seen in years. There was his old academy instructor, Sergeant Vega, who had died in a training accident over a decade ago. There was Maria Hernandez, a childhood friend who had passed away when they were only teenagers. And there at the edge of the street was his mother, who had succumbed to illness years earlier. "Mom," Martinez whispered, taking an unsteady step forward. She didn't respond. None of them did. They just stood there staring at him with blank expressions, their eyes empty and devoid of recognition. Martinez's heart ached as he reached out, but his hand passed through her as though she were made of smoke. "What is this place?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Why are you here? Why am I here? You are in between." The voice came from behind him, deep and calm, yet it carried an unnatural echo. Martinez spun around to see a tall figure cloaked in shadows. Unlike the ghostly forms of his loved ones, this being was solid, its presence commanding and almost suffocating. "Who are you?" Martinez asked, his instincts telling him to run, though his legs wouldn't obey. I am the messenger, the figure replied, its voice resonating in Martinez's chest. You are neither alive nor dead, David Martinez. You are in the place between, where those who walk the edge of death come to see the truth. Martinez shook his head, trying to process the words. What truth? Why am I here? I was at the fire. I need to go back. The messenger raised a hand and the mist around them swirled, revealing glimpses of the wildfire. Martinez saw himself running through the flames, his face contorted with fear before collapsing to the ground. You were consumed by the fire, the messenger said, but the fire is not just a force of nature. It is a force of reckoning, born of destruction and fueled by humanity's carelessness. What are you talking about? Martinez demanded. It's a wildfire. It happens every year. The messenger stepped closer and the hum in the air grew louder, more intense. Every year, humanity burns without thought. It takes and consumes, leaving the earth to suffer. The fire is not merely a consequence. It is alive, David. It feeds on your kind's greed, their destruction. And it will not stop until balance is restored. Martinez staggered back, shaking his head. No, this isn't real. Fires don't think, they don't feed, they just happen. And yet, you have seen it, the messenger said, its tone unyielding. You have seen the fire move with purpose. You have heard it speak. The fire grows stronger with every act of carelessness, every spark that could have been prevented. And now it has chosen you to carry its warning. Warning, Martinez repeated, his voice trembling. What warning? The messenger gestured again, and the mist shifted once more. This time, Martinez saw something that made his blood run cold. It was his family, Elena and Sofia. They were surrounded by flames, their faces twisted in fear as the fire closed in on them. David, Elena screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. Daddy, help, Sofia cried, reaching out toward him. Martinez ran toward the vision, his heart pounding in his chest. No, 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 no. He shouted, but no matter how fast he moved, the image stayed just out of reach. You see now, the messenger said, its voice heavy with finality. The fire takes what it is owed. Your family is but one piece of the balance it seeks. You must choose, David Martinez. Carry the warning or let the flames take them. Martinez fell to his knees, his mind reeling. The vision of his wife and daughter faded into the mist, leaving only the oppressive silence of the ghostly town. He looked up at the messenger, his voice shaking with anger and despair. How do I stop it? How do I save them? The messenger did not answer immediately. It simply stared at him, its form shifting like smoke. Then, in a voice as cold as the void, it said, That is not for me to decide. You must find the strength to face the fire. Only then will the truth be revealed. The ground beneath Martinez began to tremble, and the mist thickened, swallowing the town and the figures within it. The hum grew deafening, and the world around him seemed to collapse into itself. Martinez screamed as the vision of his family's terrified faces burned into his mind. As the ghostly town dissolved into darkness, Martinez felt himself falling, his body weightless. The messenger's final words echoed in his ears. Face the fire. The warning. Martinez felt himself falling endlessly through the dark void, his mind swirling with fragments of what he had seen. The messenger's cryptic words echoed in his ears. The fire takes what it is owed. The screams of his wife and daughter haunted him, their desperate cries cutting through his thoughts. He tried to steady his breathing, to focus, but the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Just as he thought he would be consumed by the darkness, the falling sensation stopped abruptly. Martinez opened his eyes, finding himself standing in a place that defied comprehension. The ground beneath him was scorched and cracked, glowing faintly with molten veins. Above, the sky burned with a fiery red hue, swirling with embers and ash. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating, filled with the acrid stench of smoke, and yet there was no fire here, only the unbearable heat and the suffocating atmosphere of a world on the edge of collapse. You are seeing what the fire desires, the messenger's voice rumbled, breaking the oppressive silence. Martinez turned to see the shadowy figure standing nearby, its form blending into the fiery landscape. It was taller now, more imposing, its presence radiating an undeniable power. What is this place? Martinez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This is the hunger of the flames made manifest, the messenger replied. It is the end that your kind has created, a world where the fire has consumed all. The ground trembled beneath Martinez's feet as the landscape began to shift. Images appeared in the glowing embers around him, cities engulfed in flames, skyscrapers collapsing into heaps of molten steel, forests reduced to ash. He saw rivers boiling away, their beds cracking open as the fire devoured everything in its path. Martinez's stomach twisted as he recognized some of the places. Los Angeles, San Francisco, even smaller towns he had visited as a child, all unrecognizable in the inferno. This can't be real, he muttered, shaking his head. Fires don't do this, they can't. The fire is not bound by your understanding, the messenger said. It is not merely a force of nature, it is alive, born of destruction and fueled by your kind's greed and carelessness. Martinez clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. You keep saying my kind, what do you mean by that? Humans, what have we done to cause this? The messenger turned its gaze toward him, its shadowy form flickering like flames. You take and take without thought of the cost. You strip the land bare, poison the air, and ignite the spark that feeds the fire. Every choice you make feeds its hunger, and now it grows beyond your control. Martinez's mind raced as the messenger's words sunk in. So what? This is punishment, retribution. It is balance, the messenger replied. The fire consumes to restore what has been lost, but it will not stop until it is sated. If humanity continues on its path, the flames will devour everything. Before Martinez could respond, the landscape around him shifted again. The ground beneath him cracked open, and he found himself standing on the edge of a vast abyss. From within its depths rose a towering wall of fire, its heat so intense that he instinctively stepped back. The fire roared to life, forming shapes within its flames. Martinez saw faces, some familiar, others unknown, screaming in agony as they were consumed. He saw entire cities disappearing into the inferno, their inhabitants running in vain as the fire swept over them. This is what the fire hungers for, the messenger said. It will not stop until all is consumed, unless humanity changes its course. Martinez stared into the flames, his heart pounding. How do we stop it? You cannot stop it, the messenger said, but you can warn them. You have been chosen to carry the message, to make them see the truth before it is too late. Why me? Martinez demanded. Why not someone else? I'm just a cop, I don't have the power to change the world. The messenger's form shifted closer, towering over him. Because you have seen what others cannot, you have felt the fire's hunger, heard its whispers, you have been touched by its power, and now you are marked. If you choose to return, you will carry the burden of this truth. Martinez's chest tightened. If I choose to return, what does that mean? Am I dead? You stand at the edge, the messenger replied. To return is to face unimaginable pain and sacrifice. The fire will mark you forever, but if you do not return, the warning will go unheard and the fire will consume all. Martinez felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of the decision bore down on him like a crushing force. He thought of Alina and Sofia, of their faces filled with terror as the flames closed in around them. He thought of the people he had sworn to protect, the lives that could still be saved. I'll do it, he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. I'll go back, I'll warn them. The messenger extended a shadowy hand, and Martinez felt a searing heat radiating from it. The cost will be great, it said, but the choice is yours. Martinez hesitated for only a moment before reaching out. As his hand met the messenger's, a blinding light engulfed him. Pain surged through his body, more intense than anything he had ever felt. It was as if the fire itself was burning through him, branding him with its mark. The light faded, and Martinez collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His vision blurred as the fiery landscape began to dissolve, replaced once again by darkness. Remember the warning, the messenger's voice echoed as the void consumed him. Carry it well or all will burn. Martinez felt himself slipping away, his body weightless and numb. He didn't know if he was waking up or fading into oblivion, but the messenger's words repeated in his mind like a mantra. Carry the warning. Back to reality, Martinez's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry and disoriented. A faint beeping sound pulsed steadily nearby, accompanied by muffled voices. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nose, and the cool texture of crisp sheets brushed against his skin. He blinked rapidly, the world around him slowly coming into focus. Fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow, and as his surroundings became clearer, he realized he was lying in a hospital bed. Machines beeped softly beside him, tubes snaking into his arms. David, the familiar voice cut through the haze, and he turned his head to see Alina sitting at his bedside. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but her relief was unmistakable. Beside her stood Sofia, her small hands clutching the edge of the bed, her lip trembling as she stared at him. Alina, Sofia, his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but the effort was enough to draw them closer. Alina grasped his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. You're awake, she said, her voice breaking. We thought we'd lost you. Martinez frowned, the weight of her words settling over him. What happened? You were found near the fire, Alina said. The firefighters said they couldn't believe you survived. They found your cruiser burned out and you were lying just beyond the flames, unconscious. They said it was a miracle. A miracle, Martinez echoed, his mind racing. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back down. The last thing he remembered was the fire surging toward him, the whispers, and then the messenger. The other side, the visions. His heart pounded as fragmented memories flooded his mind. Alina, he said, his voice shaking. The fire, it wasn't normal. There was something wrong. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression filled with concern. David, you're safe now. You don't have to think about it anymore. But how could he not? The images of cities burning, the cries of his wife and daughter trapped in the flames, the messenger's cryptic warnings, they were burned into his mind like scars. A doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand, interrupting his thoughts. Good to see you awake, Officer Martinez, he said with a smile. You gave us all quite a scare. Martinez nodded weakly. How long was I out? About 36 hours, the doctor replied. Your vitals were stable, but we couldn't understand how you made it out of that fire with no serious injuries. No burns, no smoke inhalation damage. It's remarkable, really. Martinez glanced at his hands, turning them over slowly. They looked normal at first, but as he shifted them in the light, he noticed something strange. A faint glowing pattern traced along his palms and fingers, like veins of molten fire. The marks were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they pulsed faintly as though they were alive. What is this? Martinez whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at his hands. Elena leaned forward, her eyes widening. David, what's wrong? Do you see it? He asked, holding his hands up toward her. She frowned, shaking her head. See what? Martinez's breath quickened. He turned his hands over again, but the glowing marks remained, pulsing faintly. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Was this real? Was he still trapped in whatever nightmare the messenger had shown him? The doctor tilted his head, studying Martinez carefully. Officer Martinez, are you feeling any pain? Numbness, Martinez shook his head. No, he hesitated, unsure of how to explain what he was seeing. Never mind. The doctor gave a small nod, clearly unconvinced but choosing not to press further. Get some rest, he said. Your body's been through a lot. As the doctor left, Martinez sank back against the pillows, his mind spinning. The glowing marks on his hands weren't the only thing that felt wrong. The hospital room was too quiet, too still. Every sound seemed muffled, distant, like he was hearing it through a veil. Elena, he said suddenly, his voice urgent. I need to tell you something about the fire. She hesitated, glancing at Sofia before responding. David, you've been through so much, maybe we should wait. No, Martinez interrupted, his voice firm. I saw something out there, something I can't explain. The fire wasn't just a fire, it was alive, it was hunting me. Elena's brow furrowed. David, you were unconscious. Maybe you had a dream, or it wasn't a dream. He snapped, his voice louder than intended. Sofia flinched, and Martinez immediately softened. I'm sorry, he said, reaching out to touch her hand. I know what I saw. Elena's eyes were filled with worry, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded slowly. We'll figure this out, she said, her voice soothing. Martinez wanted to believe her, but the weight of the messenger's warning pressed heavily on him. Humanity had unleashed the fire's hunger, and he had been chosen to deliver its message. But how could he make anyone believe him? As he lay there, the glowing marks on his hands continued to pulse faintly, a constant reminder of the other side. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, the visions returned, cities burning, faces screaming, the shadow of the messenger looming over it all. He opened his eyes again, his jaw tightening. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Whatever the cost, he had to find a way to make people understand. But as the faint hum of the machines filled the room, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if it was already too late? Martinez clenched his fists, staring at the glowing veins on his hands. He knew they were real, even if no one else could see them. The fire wasn't done with him yet, and deep down, he feared it never would be. The investigation, the glowing marks on Martinez's hands hadn't faded. Every time he looked at them, they pulsed faintly, as if the fire itself still lingered beneath his skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The messenger's warning echoed in his mind. The fire takes what it is owed. Elena had tried to convince him to rest, but Martinez couldn't sit still. Something about the fire was different, alive. He needed answers. His first stop was the precinct. The other officers greeted him warmly, expressing their relief that he had survived, but he could feel the weight of their curious stares. Whispers about his miraculous escape had already begun to circulate. In the quiet corner of his desk, Martinez sifted through recent wildfire reports. The details were eerily familiar, fires that spread too fast in defiance of natural conditions. Unusual weather patterns, sudden winds, unexplainable heat waves. Witnesses claiming to hear voices or see shadows in the flames. One case caught his attention, a small town in Northern California, completely destroyed by fire 3 years ago. The official report cited faulty electrical equipment, but scattered witness statements painted a far darker picture. Survivors spoke of a fire that moved like it was alive, consuming everything in its path with unnatural precision. He leaned closer to the screen, scanning the names of the survivors. One in particular stood out, Laura Kane. She was one of only a handful of people who had been in the town when the fire began, and her testimony had been labeled as inconsistent. Martinez smirked. He knew what that meant. She had said something the authorities didn't want to believe. Grabbing his keys, he set off to find her. Laura Kane's address led him to a rundown trailer park on the outskirts of the city. Her home was a battered single-wide trailer with peeling paint and rust along the edges. Martinez knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the still air. A moment later, it creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-40s. Her face was lined with stress, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. She stared at him warily. "You're one of them, aren't you?" she said, her voice edged with suspicion. "One of who?" Martinez asked, holding up his badge. "I'm with the LAPD. I just want to ask you a few questions about the fire in Crescent Valley." Her face softened slightly, but the tension didn't leave her shoulders. She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The inside of the trailer was cluttered but clean, the air heavy with the scent of old coffee and faintly burned incense. "You survived," Laura said bluntly, gesturing for him to sit. "The fire, I can see it on you." Martinez frowned. "What do you mean?" She pointed to his hands. "Those marks, I've seen them before. The fire leaves them on the ones it doesn't take." Martinez looked down at his glowing palms, the faint light pulsing under his skin. He leaned forward. "You've seen this before. On who?" Laura hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as if she expected someone or something to be watching. "People like you," she said finally. "People who have walked through the fire and come out the other side. They all say the same thing, that the fire spoke to them, showed them things, and then it marks them." "What happened to them?" Martinez asked. "They didn't last long," Laura said grimly. "A few weeks, maybe a month, then they disappeared. Some went back into the fire, others just vanished." Martinez's stomach tightened. He leaned in closer. "What did the fire tell you? What did you see?" Laura's eyes filled with fear. "It showed me the end. Cities burning, the earth cracking open, everything consumed by flames. It said it wasn't just fire, it was hunger, and once it starts, it doesn't stop." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You can't stop it, it's already too late." Martinez felt a chill run through him. He sat back, trying to process her words. "What do you mean, too late?" Laura shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It feeds on us, on our greed, our destruction. Every time we burn a forest, every time we build without care, it grows stronger. We woke it up and now it's spreading. You can't stop it. All you can do is try to survive." As Martinez drove back to the precinct, her words played over and over in his mind. "You can't stop it." The dread settled in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Back at his desk, he began to piece together the patterns. Every fire that matched the strange behaviors, unnatural speed, unexplainable weather, voices in the flames, had occurred in areas that had been heavily exploited by humans. Clear-cut forests, abandoned mining sites, overdeveloped land. The fire wasn't random. It was deliberate. He flipped through satellite images, his heart sinking as he noticed the telltale scorch marks left behind. In each case, the burned areas formed patterns, concentric circles, spirals, shapes that defied natural explanation. It was as if the fire were marking the land it consumed, leaving its signature behind. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his desk. Daniels, his old partner, leaned in. "You good, Martinez? You've been at this all night." Martinez glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., but he didn't feel tired. Adrenaline was coursing through him, keeping him focused. "Yeah, just trying to connect some dots," he said. Daniels glanced at the images spread across the desk. "You're not really buying into those crazy stories, are you? Voices in the flames? Come on, man." Martinez looked up at him, his expression serious. "I was there, Greg. I heard them. I saw things I can't explain. This isn't just a fire." Daniels frowned but didn't argue. "Well, whatever it is, don't let it eat you alive. Get some sleep." Martinez nodded absently as Daniels walked away, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Hours later, Martinez stared at the maps and reports on his desk. He had pieced together a disturbing timeline of the fire's spread, and it pointed to one terrifying conclusion. It was accelerating. As he leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute, his phone buzzed. It was an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "It's already too late." His heart raced as he opened the message. Attached was a grainy video of a fire engulfing a forest. Amid the crackling flames, a shadowy figure emerged, its form eerily familiar. It turned toward the camera, and Martinez's blood ran cold. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. Martinez closed the laptop, his breath shaky. The fire wasn't done with him yet, and deep down, he knew the worst was still to come. The sacrifice. Martinez sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the glow from the streetlights outside casting long shadows across the room. The stack of reports and maps on his desk felt like an insurmountable weight pressing down on him. The glowing marks on his hands pulsed faintly in the dark, a constant reminder of the fire's presence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. the flames consuming everything, the faces of those trapped within, and the messenger's chilling words. The fire takes what it is owed. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at him, but sleep felt impossible. The email he'd received earlier kept replaying in his mind. The shadowy figure, pointing directly at him through the flames, felt like a warning, or perhaps a summons. The silence in the room was broken by the faint crackle of static. Martinez froze, his heart pounding. He scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound. It grew louder, sharper, until a familiar voice cut through. "David." He spun around, and there it was. The messenger stood in the corner of the room, its shadowy form blending with the darkness. "You've returned," Martinez said, his voice shaky but steady. "The fire grows," the messenger replied, stepping closer. "It will not stop, it hungers." Martinez clenched his fists, the glow from his hands intensifying as if responding to the messenger's presence. "Then tell me how to stop it," he demanded. "I've seen what it can do, I've seen what it wants. How do I end this?" The messenger tilted its head, its form flickering like smoke. "The fire's hunger is not sated easily. It feeds on destruction, on greed, on the carelessness of humanity. You cannot stop what it has already consumed, but you can prevent what comes next." Martinez took a step forward, his jaw tightening. How the messenger's form solidified slightly, its shadowy hand pointing toward him. "Sacrifice. The fire demands balance. To halt its spread, it requires something of equal value to what it seeks to consume." Martinez's stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" "Your life," the messenger said simply. "Your soul. The fire will take you, and in doing so it will be appeased for now." The weight of the words hit Martinez like a physical blow. He staggered back, shaking his head. No, there has to be another way. I can't." "There is no other way," the messenger interrupted. "The fire is already moving toward your home, toward Alina, toward Sofia. If you do nothing, it will consume them." Martinez's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. The thought of the fire reaching his family, of them screaming for him as the flames engulfed them, was unbearable. But the thought of leaving them behind, of Sofia growing up without her father, tore at him just as deeply. "I can't just leave them," he said, his voice breaking. "They need me. I promised to protect them. And this is how you protect them," the messenger said, its tone unyielding. "Your sacrifice will ensure their safety. The fire will stop for now." Martinez sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His mind raced, trying to find another solution, another way out. But deep down, he knew the messenger was right. He had seen the fire's hunger, its relentless drive to consume. It wouldn't stop unless it was forced to. His hands trembled as he looked up at the messenger. "How do I know it'll work? How do I know the fire won't come back?" "The fire will always return," the messenger admitted. "But your sacrifice will delay it. It will give humanity time to change, to undo what has been done." Martinez laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "You think humanity will change? You think we'll stop destroying everything in our path? That is not for you to decide," the messenger said. "Your role is to give them the chance." Martinez stood, pacing the room as the weight of the decision bore down on him. His thoughts drifted to Alina and Sofia, to the life they had built together. He thought of Sofia's laugh, the way she always asked if he'd caught the bad guys at the end of every shift. He couldn't leave them. He couldn't bear the thought of not being there to watch Sofia grow up, to grow old with Alina. But he also couldn't let the fire take them. "Why me?" he asked finally, turning back to the messenger. "Why was I chosen?" "Because you saw the fire," the messenger said. "You heard its whispers. You were marked, and now you are the only one who can stop it." Martinez closed his eyes, the image of his family flashing through his mind. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Fine," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll do it. I'll give the fire what it wants." The messenger nodded, its form flickering. "It is time." The room around Martinez began to dissolve, the walls melting away into darkness. The air grew heavy, filled with the acrid scent of smoke. He was back in the fiery landscape he had seen before, the ground beneath him cracked and glowing. The flames roared to life, twisting and writhing like living creatures. In the distance, he saw Alina and Sofia, their faces contorted in terror as the fire closed in around them. "Daddy, help us," Sofia screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "Alina," Martinez shouted, running toward them. But no matter how fast he moved, the distance between them didn't close. The messenger's voice echoed around him. "Their fate lies in your hands. Will you save them, or will you let the fire take all?" Martinez stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at his glowing hands, the marks pulsing like molten veins. He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face as he made his choice. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He stepped into the flames. The fire roared as it enveloped Martinez, its heat searing his skin. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was Alina and Sofia reaching for him, their screams fading as the world turned to ash. The final confrontation, Martinez stepped into the fire, its heat searing his skin, yet it did not burn. The world dissolved into blinding light, and for a moment there was nothing, no sound, no sensation, only emptiness. Then the fire's roar returned, louder and more ferocious than before. It surrounded him, pressing against him like a living thing, testing him, probing his resolve. He stood in the heart of the inferno, a place beyond anything he could have imagined. The flames towered above him, writhing and twisting, forming shapes that resembled faces, anguished, screaming faces. The fire was alive, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. "You have come," the fire's voice boomed, a cacophony of whispers and roars that echoed in every direction. "You are marked, yet you seek to resist." Martinez steadied himself, the glow on his hands intensifying. "I'm not here to resist," he said, his voice firm despite the terror clawing at his chest. "I'm here to end this." The fire's laughter shook the ground beneath him, its flames flaring higher. "You think you can stop me? I am hunger, I am reckoning, you are nothing." Martinez's fists clenched, the glowing marks on his hands surging with light. He thought of Elena, of Sofia, of the life he had fought so hard to protect. He wasn't nothing, he was a father, a husband, and a man who refused to let this force consume everything he loved. "I may be nothing to you," he said, stepping forward, "but I have something you don't. I have something worth fighting for." The fire recoiled slightly, its laughter fading. Martinez felt a surge of courage as he pressed on. "The messenger showed me what you are," he said. "You feed on destruction, on humanity's mistakes, but you've taken enough. You won't take any more, not from me." The flames hissed and writhed, forming a massive, shadowy figure before him. Its shape was constantly shifting, its edges blurred and flickering, but its presence was undeniable. The fire stared at him, its burning eyes narrowing. "Then what will you give me?" it asked, its voice filled with malice. Martinez's chest tightened. He knew the answer, but saying it aloud made it real. "Myself," he said, "my soul, my life. Take me and leave them alone." The fire surged forward, its heat intensifying. "A worthy sacrifice," it said, its tone almost mocking. "But words mean nothing. Show me." Martinez closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The glowing marks on his hands burned brighter, their light cutting through the darkness. He could feel the fire's hunger clawing at him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. "I give myself to you," he said, his voice steady. "But in return you stop, you leave them alone. You give them a chance to change." The fire hesitated, its form flickering. For a moment it seemed unsure, almost vulnerable. Then, with a deafening roar, it surged toward him, engulfing him completely. Martinez screamed as the fire consumed him, its heat searing through every fiber of his being. He felt as though he were being torn apart, his very essence pulled in every direction. Images flashed before his eyes, Elena and Sofia, their laughter, their smiles, the life they had built together. He clung to those memories, using them as a shield against the fire's relentless assault. "You won't win," he growled through clenched teeth. "I won't let you." The fire resisted, pushing harder, but Martinez held his ground. The glowing marks on his hands spread, their light growing brighter and stronger, cutting through the flames. The fire screamed in rage, its form writhing as it tried to smother him, but Martinez didn't back down. He reached deep within himself, drawing on every ounce of strength and love he had left. He thought of Sofia's tiny hand in his, of Elena's embrace, of all the people who deserved a future free from this inferno. "You don't get to decide," he shouted, his voice echoing through the flames. "This ends now." The light from his hands exploded outward, a blinding burst that pierced through the fire's darkness. The flames recoiled, their roar fading into a low hiss. The faces in the fire began to disappear, their anguished expressions softening as the light washed over them. The fire began to shrink, its hunger weakening. The ground beneath Martinez steadied, and the oppressive heat began to fade. He felt a strange calm settle over him, though his body felt like it was on the brink of collapse. As the fire diminished, the landscape around Martinez began to change. The scorched earth beneath him sprouted new life, grass, flowers, even saplings rising from the ashes. The air grew cooler, the acrid smell of smoke replaced by the fresh scent of rain. Martinez fell to his knees, his energy spent. He looked down at his hands, the glowing marks fading to faint scars. The fire had taken something from him, something he couldn't quite name, but it had stopped. "You did it," a voice said behind him. Martinez turned to see the messenger standing nearby, its form less shadowy now, almost translucent. "The fire has been appeased," it said. "For now," Martinez nodded weakly, his body trembling. "Will it come back?" "Yes," the messenger said. "It will always hunger, but your sacrifice has bought humanity time to change, time to learn." Martinez's vision blurred, exhaustion pulling him under. "And if they don't," he whispered. The messenger's form began to fade. "Then it will return, and it will not stop." Martinez's strength gave out, and he collapsed onto the ground. The last thing he saw was the sun breaking through the clouds, its light washing over the renewed landscape. A faint smile touched his lips as he closed his eyes, his body succumbing to the darkness. Martinez's body lay still, the ground around him covered in new life. The fire was gone, but the scars it left behind remained. Whether Martinez had survived, or whether his sacrifice had truly been enough, was a question left unanswered. Outrow, the first thing Martinez felt was the cool touch of a gentle breeze against his skin. His eyes fluttered open, and he was met with the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the window. The faint hum of machines buzzed in the background, and for a moment he wondered if he was still caught in the fire's grasp, but then he saw them, Elena and Sofia. His wife sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly, tears streaming down her face. Sofia's small hands rested on his arm, her wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto his. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Elena, Sofia." His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it was enough to draw them closer. "You're awake," Elena said, her voice breaking as she leaned forward to kiss his forehead. "You're alive," Martinez nodded weakly, his body feeling like it had been through a war, and perhaps it had. Memories of the fire, the messenger, and his final confrontation flashed through his mind. He had stepped into the fire, offered himself as a sacrifice, and yet here he was. How? He murmured, his voice barely audible. "The firefighters found you," Elena explained, her voice still trembling. "They said you were lying in the middle of the burned area, but there wasn't a single mark on you, not even a burn. They don't understand how you survived." Martinez swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't have an answer, at least not one he could explain to her. The glowing marks on his hands were gone, replaced by faint scars that traced the same patterns. They didn't glow anymore, but they were a constant reminder of what he had seen, what he had done. Martinez sat up slowly, ignoring the protests of his body. Outside the window, the sky was clear, and the air felt fresher, lighter, as though the fire had cleansed more than just the land. He glanced at Elena, her face filled with relief, and then at Sofia, who clung to his arm like she never wanted to let go. "I thought I lost you," Elena said softly. "I thought so too," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. He looked at Sofia and smiled weakly. "You kept me going, you know that. You and your mom, you're the reason I'm here." Sofia's lip quivered, and she threw her arms around his neck. "Don't leave us again, Daddy." "I won't," he whispered, holding her tightly. "I promise." But deep down, Martinez knew that wasn't a promise he could guarantee. The fire had taken him to a place few had seen, and the messenger's warning still lingered in his mind. The fire will return. Later that evening, as his family slept, Martinez sat alone at the kitchen table. The faint scars on his hands seemed to pulse in the moonlight, a quiet reminder of the fire's hunger. He opened a notebook, his pen trembling in his hand, and began to write. He wrote about the fire that wasn't just a fire. He described the hunger he had felt, the way it had spoken, the way it had consumed. He wrote about the messenger, its warnings, and the terrible visions it had shown him. Martinez paused, his pen hovering over the page. He knew this story wouldn't be easy to share. Who would believe him? Who would listen? But he had to try. "The fire doesn't just burn trees and buildings," he wrote. "It burns humanity's greed, our recklessness. It feeds on what we take without giving back. It's a warning, a chance to change before it's too late. But if we don't listen, it will return, stronger and hungrier than ever. We won't escape it a second time." He sat back, staring at the words he had written. They felt heavy, as though they carried the weight of the world. The next morning, Martinez stood outside with Elena and Sofia, watching the sunrise. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh earth and renewal. For the first time in days, the horizon was free of smoke. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Elena said, slipping her hand into his. Martinez nodded, his eyes scanning the distance. "Yeah, it is." But even as he spoke, a faint unease stirred in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that the fire's hunger wasn't truly gone, only dormant. He glanced down at his hands, the scars catching the light, and his jaw tightened. The fire had given him a second chance, but it had also left him with a question that wouldn't leave his mind. As the sun rose higher, bathing the land in warmth, Martinez whispered the question aloud, his voice barely audible. "Will we learn or will we burn?"